Asaf, and do you prefer Liz or Elizabeth? Because I was, in my mind, call you Liz.
Well, I mean, I guess we're not all friends yet, so Elizabeth will do.
All right. So Asaf and Elizabeth. So what we're going to do, and this is the preferred format here for the Foundation for Middle East Peace, is we're going to have a conversation up here on the dais, and then when we've completed that conversation to our satisfaction, which means about 40, 45 minutes, we will open it up to questions for about an equal amount of time. So you'll get your shot. If I don't manage to ask what you want to know, you will have a chance to ask what it is you want to know. So I want to start off, and I will admit that I have the benefit of having sat down with these two this morning and peppered them with questions. So I already know how phenomenally interesting and insightful they both are. But it occurs to me that you don't. So I think a good place to start is to let each of them talk a little bit about who they are, what their personal story is, so that we understand what brought them to this. And then from there, we'll move on to the work itself in the organization, and then some discussion of events or current developments in the region. So Asaf, why don't you start us off with a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Thank you very much, Lara, for inviting us and having us here. And thank you very much for being here. I'm 45. I was raised in one of the most extreme right-wing settlements in the West Bank called Kiryat Arba, to a family of Yemenite origin. Both my grandparents were born in Yemen, so I'm of Yemenite origin. Studied in a yeshiva high school in Efrat, which is also, partially in the West Bank or beyond the Green Line. So to a religious Orthodox family and environment. And back in 1995, when I served in the military, I was severely injured in a suicide attack committed by Hamas, a member activist on a bus. And then after an additional 8 years of service in the military, I quit and started my master's degree and PhD studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, focusing on civil-military relations in Jordan. That's about it, I think. Is it enough?
I was born in the former Soviet Union to parents who were both political prisoners, spent collectively 12 years in the gulags for anti-regime activity. Then, when other Jews were allowed to leave Israel, we made our way there, where I also grew up in the settlement, also in Gush Etzion, called Kfar Eldad, raised by quite a right-wing family and community surrounding me. I served in military intelligence in Israel as an analyst, and during that service became very interested in the Middle East. And after I completed my service, I realized that I could use social media to connect to people in countries I could never visit. So I began talking to people in Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, to just understand what their lived experiences are like. And through that process of talking to people, many of them would then go on to become leaders of uprisings in their own countries. They were talking to me back in 2008, 2009 about the corruption, the inequalities, the human rights abuses. So through those connections, through those friendships, my views began to shift. And after doing a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies, I joined the forum when it was established in 2014, and my research is still very much based similarly to the research of many other fellows at the forum on one-to-one contact with people across the Middle East, and not just elites, also average people, activists, journalists who work in the region. My background and Asaf's background are quite different from that of typical people who are, provide commentary to the Israeli public about the Middle East. Many of them are ex-generals who grew up in a kind of a privileged upbringing in central Israel, while Asaf and I and other members of the forum are oftentimes much younger, a lot more women than the average think tank in Israel. A lot more diverse ethnically, so we have Palestinian members, we have Jewish members, And we have experts from different fields. So we have academics, doctors, professors, but also journalists, activists, people who are practitioners and know the region through interacting with its inhabitants.
So, just to follow up on that, thank you both. And I have said I'm always a little bit humbled asking people to share their personal stories. I mean, it is something to ask people to, in a sense, accredit themselves with an audience by telling us personal details about themselves. So thank you for that. I'd be interested, and Elizabeth has given us sort of a flavor of the people that are part of this. I would be interested, and I speak as someone who is an avid consumer of analysis coming out of Israel, to have some clarification on what it is that is so different about what you're doing. And maybe, Asaf, if you could also talk about, what your audience is. I know that most of what you do is in Hebrew, not all of it. What is the intended audience, and how, maybe you can both talk a little bit, how it is received, what impact you see it making, or what impact you hope it will make, in addition to what it may be making already.
We live in strange times in which fact-based analysis, and I think my strong assumption is that you share the same thing here in the US, like us, that a fact-based analysis that takes into consideration perceptions and perspectives from many angles, many players on a specific issue, is perceived as partisan or biased. And this is indeed a very strange issue, because we believe in the forum, this is the dissemination of information and analysis that we make, is that fact-based analysis is the precondition for understanding both yourself, your adversaries, your opponents, and the reality in which you operate. So I think the basic characteristic of the forum and the forum members is the professionalism. All of us come from either academia or activism, civic activism, or journalism. All of us have deep information about the topics that we research. And I think this is a strong point when presenting our information to the Israeli public and the Israeli state institutions, that is on our positive side. I mean, people might say, they're left-wing, probably leaning, they're pro-Palestinians, but they're still professionals. And if I go back to the different pieces of bio of both Elizabeth and myself and other members of the forum, we have a PLO member who's a PLO official, who's a member in the forum. I mean, in Israeli terms, this is really unthinkable to have a think tank based on both Palestinian and Jewish research and analysts. So if you take into consideration the pieces of bio and the background, the personal background, the professional backgrounds of the members of the forum, I think that it gives us credibility in the Israeli public and the Israeli state institutions. Now, there are two main missions or goals of the forum. One is, and probably the most important one, is to create a different consciousness, a more complex, more nuanced vision among the Israeli public opinion. So it's definitely bottom up, among the Israeli public opinion towards Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, and the role of Israel and Israelis in this regard. The second mission is to talk to whomever might want to talk to us in state institutions and in the Israeli public, including pre-military schools, to talk to everyone who's willing to hear us in order to strengthen and bolster some islands of pragmatism and professionalism that still exist in Israeli state institutions, and have not been eroded yet by political recklessness of the right wing in Israel. So this is I think, a difficult mission. We know it's a difficult mission. It's very difficult to affect and influence public opinion in a setting like the Israeli-Palestinian setting, an Israel-Middle East setting. But we're doing our best. Usually, academics write long papers. Also, Israeli academics write long papers in academic papers in English that only 40 people probably around the world read. But they're not willing to talk to their own communities and enrich them with what they know about the issues that they are analyzing and researching and studying. So we're doing precisely this with the different Israeli audiences, and it's been quite a journey for us for the past 7 years.
And I would say, with regards to influence, the mere fact that we are present now in Israeli media and our experts are called on to provide commentary on events as they unfold in the Middle East is a very positive sign. Simply because that space in the past has been really dominated by either right-wing academics or people who emerge out of the military establishment, who have insights naturally, but their view is very much shaped by perceptions of threat, of trying to identify threats. It's the job of the intelligence community, of the security establishment, to identify threats as they emerge, not necessarily identify positive trends that are happening, opportunities, and therefore the Israeli public, when discussing the Middle East, the narrative that is dominant is one focused on threat perception and how things affect Israel. Well, we try to analyze Middle Eastern countries and societies in their own context. Oftentimes, Israel is simply not the big story. It doesn't concern a lot of people. People are focused on their own problems, on their own regimes, on things that affect their daily lives. And this is the type of analysis that we try to provide to the Israeli public.
So that's a great segue. So people are interested in the things that affect their daily lives. So I want to pivot away for a second from the forum itself and what it is, and you're welcome to jump in and say more if you want. I want to pivot to some of your expertise, because you are both experts in your own right on a whole range of issues that are of great interest, I think, to Washington. And I think if anything you write in English would actually be probably very well received. Elizabeth, I would like to start with you on this piece. Once again, we're hearing news about a possible Trump peace plan, imminent. And it's been pretty clear since the outset of this administration's policy that one of the pillars of its policy is this idea that the Arab part of it will be carried by a party other than the Palestinians. The analysis supporting the viability of that sort of idea tends to come from people who have not spent a great deal of time in the countries that are supposed to be carrying the water for the peace plan. This is something where you personally, I think, do a lot of work on the ground. So can you talk a little bit about the viability of that plan and from the point of view of someone who is talking to folks on the ground?
Great. So I think the strategy of the Israeli government and the Trump administration is largely to bring about normalization of relations between Israel and Arab regimes, Sunni Arab regimes in the Gulf, in Northern Africa. And this is something that is a top priority for the current Israeli government, because in the past, the left in Israel alone could promise peace, while it struggled to offer security, while the right in Israel focused on saying we will provide you with security. The left cannot do that. So now the right wing in Israel is attempting to convince the Israeli public that with us you can get both security, in the form of maintaining the occupation, and you can also get peace. Look at all the Arab leaders who are rushing to embrace us publicly or under the table. And I think this strategy will have very limited success because Arab regimes in the region are aware of the fact that while there is a certain shift that is occurring in public opinion in the Arab world with regards to Israel among the populace at large, overall, Arabs do not want to perceive themselves as abandoning the Palestinians, as stabbing them in the back. So as long as the occupation remains, as long as there is no progress on the Palestinian issue, Arab publics will not be on board with normalization of relations, and definitely not with forcing an agreement on the Palestinians that is unacceptable. So there is no concrete information on what's going to be in this miraculous peace plan that will solve everything. But what we do know thus far from leaks is a plan that would be completely unacceptable to Palestinians and Arabs, including non-removal of settlements, which means that the Palestinian state that will emerge in place, assuming it does emerge, and I don't think it will not be a viable state. It will be essentially Bantustans, right? So I don't see Arab publics agreeing to this. And even though the Arab world is ruled by authoritarian regimes, they still do care about public opinion. This is why relations between the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime, and Israel are quite close. There's cooperation for years now, intelligence cooperation, extensive cooperation. And still, we're not seeing those relations emerging to the public because those regimes, despite being authoritarian, despite being repressive, are concerned about public opinion. So as long as Israel does not move to end the occupation, I don't see this normalization, this peace deal really taking off.
I'll just maybe add one thing about the Palestinian issue. I think that the perception in Israel, and especially among the right wing, is that Israel has already defeated the Palestinian national movement, and that the next stage would be to defeat and to annihilate Palestinian nationalism. So, or collective identity, Palestinian collective identity, namely, we treat you in the future, we might treat you as individuals with, equal rights or second-rate citizens, but you'll have no recognition of not a state, obviously, and not as a people. So in this regard, I think that the counter argument or the counter strategic venue for the Israeli left or Israeli right wing, including the Zionist left wing, would be to help the Palestinians stand on their feet and establish a state, a functional state, with the help of Israel taking more responsibility for 50 years of occupation.
Thank you. I want to follow up with you, Asaf. So Elizabeth is talking about the idea shared by the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government that it can bypass the Palestinians and make peace with other Arab states. Interestingly, though, along the way, it appears to have quite readily and willingly sacrificed its relationship with its previous Arab peace partner, Jordan, which in many ways, Jordan and Egypt were sort of the dual pillars of Israel's policy in the region, and it had these peace treaties and good relations. We have all watched as those relations with Jordan have eroded in recent years, most notably with the decision to not renew the lease on the land, and we saw the killing the embassy, and we saw the every time anything happens on Jerusalem, you see this dramatic erosion in relations. As someone who is an expert on the domestic situation inside Jordan and the different trends in play there, pulling one another in tension, can you talk about the shifts in Jordanian society as pertains to Jordan's strategic relationship and strategic alliance until now with Israel, and what that means going forward, whether it's with respect to a peace plan or respect to Jordan's role as the guardian of Muslim sacred spaces inside Israel or Jerusalem and beyond?
I think that the Jordanians, the Jordanian elite especially, including the Hashemite monarchy, has for decades believed that Israel is taking them for granted, and they were right. Israel has taken Jordan for granted for many years, even before the peace accord, the peace treaty between the two countries, and also after the peace process and the peace treaty. And the main thing here, I think, on the part of Israel is that Jordan was always considered as a strategic partner against the Palestinians. You know, the notion was, you hate the Palestinians, we hate the Palestinians, let's collaborate, let's cooperate. And obviously it was true to an extent during different phases between Jordan and Israel, and obviously with the very complicated relationship between Jordan and the Palestinians and the Palestinian National Movement. But especially after the peace treaty was signed between Jordan and Israel, the notion was in Jordan that Jordan has to see a Palestinian state established in the West Bank, because otherwise Jordan will become Palestine. And the notion in Jordan was that we signed the peace treaty with Israel mainly because we want to bury the alternative homeland nightmare, as it were, for Jordanians. Now, if Israel is sincere, or to the extent that it was sincere in establishing a Palestinian state, then relations between Jordan and Israel were okay. But as soon as it was clear to Jordanians that the right wing in Israel not only prevents a Palestinian state, but wants to annihilate, as I said, the very idea of Palestinian nationalism, then Israel and Jordan are ultimately on a path of clash between the two sides. Now, the worrisome thing, and the most worrisome thing, I think, is that the erosion on the part of on the Jordanian side towards Israel comes from the very East Banker Transjordanian elite that is and was the backbone of the Hashemite monarchy, not the Palestinians. I mean, the Palestinians have their own view on Israel, and it's not very different from the Palestinians in the West Bank, obviously. But the partnership, the strategic partnership between Jordan and Israel, always relied on the Transjordanian elite. And if the Transjordanian elite sees Israel as the main spoiler and the main problem in this regard of establishing a Palestinian state, then they start to have resentment towards Israel and start to sabotage the peace treaty between the two countries, because they see, and again I think they are right, that they see Israel as non-honest partner in this regard. And I think that this is what we see now. I want to connect it, what I just said, to what the forum does and what the others, I believe, don't. Is that look at the civilian aspect of relations, of bilateral relations, of trilateral relations in the Middle East, and of multilateral relations in the Middle East. When you come from the military or security establishment, as Elizabeth said, you're concerned with threats. This is true, and this is probably understandable when you talk about state institutions. But if you talk about academia, you talk about civic activism, you talk about learning, you talk about education, you have to take into considerations the perceptions of the other side, and not just what's best for the Jews or best for Israel, because this is no relevance whatsoever to what's happening in the Middle East. So we try to look at in this context in Jordan-Israel relations, not just about the strategic partnership, because strategic partnership used to be long before the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. And if you remember or know about the 1973 war, that there was a war, an official war between Israel and Jordan, in which Jordan and Israel were secretly in cooperation on the movement of the Jordanian tanks on the Syrian front. So this is mind-boggling. And this was way before the peace, the official peace between both sides. So strategic partnership, there is and there was, but if you see what's happening beneath the surface and beneath the ground, then it's I think it's very troubling to see it.
Yeah, when you and I spoke earlier, we talked about some shifts in sort of public opinion, and I think Elizabeth alluded to it, this idea that at a grassroots level there is in some ways more interest in, more openness to Israel than there was previously, and then Elizabeth alluded also to the limits on that. And that strikes me as a really interesting tension with exploring at a moment when it's hard to imagine right now a path back to a two-state solution or any kind of negotiated peace. We all hope there will be, and we'll all keep working to get there. I count everyone in the room as part of that working. But when we talk about the possibility, it is interesting to remind people that there are these trends that, if in the early 2000s we had the Arab Peace Initiative, which offered this great opportunity, which was just ignored and lost, that it doesn't mean it's lost forever. It doesn't mean actually that there can't be more interesting opportunities, but there's no shortcuts. You can't shortcut around Israel-Palestine to get there, but they still offer a way forward. Speaking of things that are really terribly depressing to talk about, not that. Elizabeth, anyone who's not following Elizabeth on Twitter should be. You can throw out your Twitter handle later. Elizabeth is one of the keenest observers of regional policy and Israeli policy on Twitter in English, and she tweets prolifically. You tweeted a fascinating thread last night and through this morning on the Likud primaries. And this is maybe something, if you could, illuminate for us a little bit what happened in those primaries, sort of the good news, bad news, and also how it speaks to what role a different voice could play in the next, facing another government which is very likely to be very right-wing and very much doing what it's done before, but only more so.
So the next Israeli elections it appears to be, will largely be a contestation within the right over division of votes, basically. Currently, there doesn't appear to be any chance for anyone but Netanyahu to be the next prime minister, at least until he's indicted, and then we'll see if the coalition buckles and collapses. So what we're seeing is, the Likud, and then the new right party that split off from the Jewish Home Party, and then we have the Jewish Home Party that still exists, and even more right-wing parties, Avigdor Lieberman's party, who was the Minister of Defense and quit after Israel did not go to war with Gaza past couple of months, and he and many others in the Israeli right were displeased with that. They believe that Hamas rocket fire merits a more forceful response in the form of a major military campaign on Gaza. And then we have even more right-wing parties, the Kahanist parties, parties that basically support the creation of a theocracy in Israel, ethnically cleansing Palestinians, etc. So in this type of sphere, naturally, parties, when they vie for the same type of group of voters, and the blocs are largely consolidated, the left and the right and the center, the competition is over who is more outrageous, who is more racist, who is more populist. And during the Likud primaries, we saw a lot of backbench members of Knesset really put on quite horrific racist campaign ads, stirring all sorts of provocations, creating kind of clips, humiliating Palestinians, talking about Palestinian members of Knesset as terrorists, as the supporters of terrorism, as the Hamas branch in the Israeli Knesset, as people who should be in prison, etc. This, of course, is immensely destructive to Arab-Jewish relations within Israel. And these types of campaign videos, election sloganeering has a long-term impact on Israeli society that goes much beyond elections. In the Likud primaries, interestingly, the folks who adopted the most kind of extreme and populist and racist rhetoric lost out in the primaries. So multiple members of Knesset, such as Oren Chazan, Anat Berko, Yaron Mazuz, all of them are now basically, Likud is expected to get 30, maybe 35 seats. They're beyond that, so they'll not be members of Knesset in the next Knesset. So the Likud party is more moderate comparatively to the current list. And I emphasize the word comparatively, right? Because it is, the Likud party is very, very different from what Likud was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Now, interestingly, individuals supported by Netanyahu did not do particularly well, especially David Sharan, who was supported by Netanyahu to be the Likud candidate for the Tel Aviv kind of district. He is involved in one of Netanyahu's corruption scandals. He lost out, and he lost out to a candidate supported by Gidon Saar. Gidon Saar is Netanyahu's kind of main rival within the party, and he also did well in the primary. He is currently, with the current vote tally, he's in 5th place. And also 2 other members of Knesset who defied Netanyahu in very minor ways, but in the Likud party, where Netanyahu tried to foster kind of total obedience, this was something extraordinary. So Yuli Edelstein and Israel Katz both entered the first 5 places. So this primary election was in a way a rebuke to both Netanyahu and also to the most extreme, embarrassing kind of members of Knesset, who would go on Facebook Live while they punch people. Literally, I mean, this is the type of politics that we're now experiencing in Israel. So this means that now parties that are more to the right will have an easier time presenting the list, the Likud list, as kind of too left-wing, you should be voting for us. So it's definitely going to be an interesting election season, and I expect that, unfortunately, we'll see a lot more kind of violent, racist rhetoric in the coming months until April.
That's very good. So I have actually a question that we didn't prepare in advance. I mean, we didn't prepare questions, so I more or less told them what I want to ask them about. But Asaf, I'm curious, and I'm not sure how much there's to say about this. You guys write mainly in Hebrew, but you engage on the ground. You're talking to folks on the ground, people you work with, and you're part of a world of academia that in this era, right, of global conferences and the internet and Twitter, I mean, Elizabeth and I on Twitter engage people all over the world in countries, and everyone's talking to each other. I'm interested to know what sort of interactions the forum creates with your counterparts. There are academics and activists and other kinds of experts across the Arab world who I suspect are similarly trying to transcend old traditional politics, traditional strictures, to have a more fact-driven, robust discourse and to engage people on the other side. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. As I said, the mission, the first mission of the forum is talk to the Israeli public, and therefore 90% of our work is done in Hebrew. The writing is in Hebrew, the media appearances are in Hebrew, and we have a very small portion of our activity in English. Now, regarding connections and ties with institutions and academics and pundits and journalists in the Arab world, we do have them, both on a personal and an organizational level. But because of the occupation and because of the issue of normalization, they cannot do, events with us or activities with us on a public level officially. But the thing is that most forum members and analysts talk to their counterparts in the respective countries and organizations, whether in my case Jordan, in Liz's case Syria, and other Friends of the Forum case in Kurdistan, in whatever, many places. And we've saw some very interesting coverage of us in Arabic newspapers, which was fascinating for us because I think it was 3-4 years ago there was a long cover story on Haaretz on the forum and the mission of the forum, and it was translated to English and then translated to Arabic by an organization based in Ramallah called the Madar Center. And from then, we started to see our OPADs and analysis being published in Al Mayadeen, which is a pro-Hezbollah media outlet in Lebanon. And people started quoting us. And it was very interesting to see it because sometimes they would say, there are these group of outsiders in the Israeli academia from Islam and Middle East Studies that see Arabs actually as human beings. So very, very interesting to see. To cut a long story short, we do have cooperation. It cannot be public, but basically all the information and knowledge and analysis that we do is basically a combination of things that we hear and things that we read ourselves.
Yeah, and I think in that sense our approach is quite unique, particularly in Israel, where research of the Middle East, first of all, focuses on the 17th century, nothing newer, and on textual analysis. The longer, the more complicated. Reading old texts and analyzing them and publishing it in journals that are read by several dozens of people, maybe a book also in English. God forbid the Israeli public learns what you've dedicated years to study. So our research is on top of being published in Hebrew and dealing with current affairs, is based on contact with people in the countries and the regions that we research. And that contact is not limited just to elites, people whom we meet at conferences, but also just people on the ground, average individuals, who oftentimes have a different perspective from those of the elites or politicians. I mean, the Arab uprisings, for example, were not foreseen by the leadership of the Arab world, or they would have been able to counter them more effectively, prevent them from erupting in the first place. But I was talking to people on the ground, back in 2008, 2009, and they were saying, like, things are boiling here. This is unbearable. Our salaries, we are able to purchase less and less. Corruption is going crazy. Each of our leaders, is getting older, and some of them are seeking to replace themselves with their sons or cousins. This is unacceptable to us. And it took, one person in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, to light himself on fire to start this kind of chain reaction. But all those tensions were boiling in the Middle East for a long time before they erupted. So that's why I think it's so important to talk to just average civilians, activists, community organizers, to really understand societies in their own eyes, not through the eyes of elites or media personalities. I think there's a growing recognition of that in Washington, but it's still something, that type of research is incredibly labor intensive. It involves talking to a lot of people, and I don't see much of it being done.
One thing, we were talking about this before. You said there's a growing recognition in Washington. I actually think that in some ways what you're doing suggests what needs to be a growing trend. We still live, much like in Israel, where the priority is given to opinions and analysis from people who've served in military or national security infrastructure. All of us who follow Israel and Palestine know that the most expert views are considered those who have perpetually failed in making peace, right? You want to find out what the view is on the Palestinians, talk to someone who has failed in negotiations with the Palestinians. There is a question, I think, in the city, there's never been a great deal of weight given to the people who do the less sexy research, the folks who have not been privy to the discussions. One thing we were talking before, and I'd be interested, actually, if you would talk about this a little bit, for instance, the idea of Palestinian, who will follow Abbas, which is a question we have here all the time. And the sort of, there's something almost vapid about the responses, as if there aren't forces working upon the Palestinian body politic, which will say whether or not you'll have an ex-successful leader. They're separate from some Orientalist idea of how Arabs choose their leaders and their successors. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, when you ask, not to mention Israeli security or ex-security or ex-military general, but even when you ask an Israeli academic about who will be the successor or the heir to Abbas, then they start, talking about, the chances of this and the chances of Dahlan and the chances of Rajub, and he's associated with the UAA, and he's associated with Bahrain, and the other was associated, has the backing of Sisi, and so on and so on. And our response would always be, in Israel, we usually call Abu Mazen Abu Mazen, which translates in Hebrew to Abu Hu. So what does it matter who will replace Abu Mazen as long as Israel treats the guy the same thing as she treated Abu Mazen? So if we want really an effective, responsible leader on the Palestinian side that will be able to cut a deal with Israel, we have to respect the man chosen or nominated by the Palestinian Liberation or woman, stay in the Middle East. But we have to accept the leader, the Palestinian leader, and if we wanted to have some sort of, as again, security military establishment in Israel used to suggest that we should have a positive competition between Gaza and the West Bank. We should reward the West Bank leadership for cooperating with Israel and move forward with the peace process. Obviously, eventually it didn't happen, but if we do it, then it would then it would be meaningful to ask who will be the next Palestinian leader. But as long as we don't treat the Palestinian leader as a leader, but as a subcontractor of Israeli occupation in the West Bank, then he will be meaningless.
All right, so I want to ask Elizabeth one last question. It's an easy one, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Syria. Easy. No, we could have an entire event or a whole series of events just talking about what's happening in Syria, what's gone wrong in terms of U.S. policy in Syria. What I would be most interested to learn from you is what game you think Israel is playing in Syria. I read everything published on this, and I will admit that I am confused.
Okay, so I think Israeli policy is confusing to people because there is an assumption that is common in the region that Israel is all powerful and all influential. And therefore, whatever is happening in Syria, and different powers had the upper hand at different points in the conflict, there is an assumption that Israel is somehow behind it. And in reality, Israel played quite a limited role in the Syrian civil war. Initially, there was the belief inside the Israeli military establishment that Assad will soon fall. That was the intelligence assessment in Israel and in many other countries around the world, because other leaders were successfully toppled. Protests were quite robust. Millions came to the streets to demand the removal of the regime. And when the uprising became militarized, the Assad regime lost control of 80% of the country's territory. But Assad kept his hold on power, and gradually Israeli intelligence, the Israeli security establishment began to realize that he's not going anywhere. And at the same time, the Syrian opposition began radicalizing. So from being dominated by factions affiliated with the Free Syrian Army, we saw the emergence of Salafi and even jihadi groups. And at the same time, to help Assad remain in power, we saw an intervention by Iran and by Hezbollah directly in the conflict. And then Israel, the security establishment kind of adopted an approach of, good luck to both sides, right? Let the jihadis, the Shia ones, kill the Sunni ones, right? And Israel maintained that approach for a while, largely, just observing events, and occasionally striking weapon convoys that Iran would ship to Hezbollah through Syrian territory. As in 2014, as the Obama administration became more engaged in the war and began providing lethal assistance to Free Syrian Army groups, particularly in southern Syria, Israel began seeing the Free Syrian Army and their conglomeration in the south that was called the Southern Front as a positive alternative to the rule of both Assad and more radical groups. And Israel encouraged the Obama administration to increase support for the rebels in the south. The Obama administration had its own priorities and did not follow the requests or advice of Israel. Gradually, as the tide of war in Syria shifted in favor of the Assad regime because of the Russian intervention that started in September 2015, and also a significant buildup of Iranian forces in the country. Israel became increasingly concerned about developments in Syria, basically watching Syria through the Iran lens. At that point, Israel began providing lethal assistance to, or significantly expanded the lethal assistance it provided to rebels in Quneitra and Daraa in southern Syria. It also increased significantly the provision of humanitarian assistance to southern Syria, much of it financed, by the way, by Zionist Christians, not actually by Israeli taxpayers. And those donors saw, and the Israeli establishment saw this aid effort as, first of all, a Hezbollah success, right? It definitely improved the image of Israel in southern Syria. I would talk to Syrians living in the south, and they could be easily described as Zionists. They would even begin justifying Israeli policies towards Palestinians because they experienced Israel as a country that is providing them with humanitarian assistance, that is bringing their injured into Israeli hospitals that they believed to be excellent, where they received really, really great care. Opinion there shifted significantly. And this effort of provision of both weaponry and humanitarian assistance remained in place until the Assad regime, with Russian assistance, took over southern Syria in July of last year. Israel, recognizing that the tide of war shifted in favor of the regime and in favor of Russia, the Obama administration refused to increase assistance to the rebels in the south. The Trump administration refused to back up the rebels as the regime made the intentions clear that it will reconquer the south. And Israel simply cut a deal with the Russians before the onslaught of the regime was starting on southern Syria. Under this deal, basically Russia would guarantee the removal of Iranian forces and pro-Iranian militias from southern Syria, and in exchange, Israel would simply stand idly by as the regime reconquers the territory. This, of course, led to major disappointment among civilians and rebels who were supported by Israel, who honestly changed their view of Israel and believed that Israel, you're so much better than the Arabs, they all abandoned us, you're still, you're helping us. And then another betrayal, right? So a lot of them are now deeply disappointed by Israel, by what they perceive as, abandoning them. But still, I think to some extent, some of the goodwill that Israel managed to generate, there are people today who are alive in southern Syria because of medical care they received in Israel. This is not something that goes away. And their entire family knows about it, social circles. But the Israeli policy was largely focused on the Iranian issue, even though it was not perceived this way by Syrians, who supporters of the regime would say that Israel supports the opposition. Supporters of the opposition believe that Israel wants Assad to stay. In reality, Israel mostly cares about the Iranian issue, about preventing the establishment of permanent bases by Iran in Syria, preventing the flow of weaponry, particularly precision missiles from Iran to Hezbollah through Syria, and the use of chemical weapons. Other WMD is also something, a major source of concern for Israel. And Israel facilitated in some ways the deal that led to the destruction of most of the chemical weapon stockpiles of Assad regime after it perpetrated the massacre in 2013 and on Ghouta. So those are the top Israeli concerns, and through this, its policy of covert military assistance and avert humanitarian assistance, was also able to achieve a goal of improving its image in the Middle East and particularly among Syrians.
Thank you. And I should say, Assad is based in Israel. Elizabeth is for now based in Washington. So I'm hoping we will have the opportunity to have other panels focused on other issues, including Syria with the U.S. participants. So thank you. We are now going to open it up to questions. My colleague Kristen has a microphone. If you raise your hand, she will come and find you. We ask the questions be relatively short and in the form of question mark with a question mark, or question with a question mark at the end. Hold on one second. Yes, all right. So there's one over there and one over there to begin.
Hi, fascinating panel on this.
Oh, I'm sorry, before you start, I should say we are live streaming this, so you are going to be on video if you do ask a question. And I ask that you do identify yourself before you ask a question.
Christopher Hansen, a retired government official. On the views of the settlers in the settlements, is there any evolution? Is there any emergence of more pro-Palestinian perspective at all, as given their residents as neighbors, or is it only heartening?
So I would say that there is an evolution in the view of settlers with regards to Palestinians. It's just not the evolution that we would like to see. So what we're seeing is increasing use of violence against Palestinians for political goals. So in the past, settler violence against Palestinians has always been an issue, as we've discussed, back in the 80s and the 90s. But what we're seeing now are concentrated violent campaigns against Palestinians as a tactic of deterrence against the Israeli state when the Israeli state comes to remove outposts that are illegal also under Israeli law in the West Bank. So outposts are usually built on private Palestinian land. The owners of the land sue and demand access to their land back. And then the state is forced to go and remove some of the outposts that exist in the West Bank. In those instances, you see basically a mass terror campaign against Palestinians in an effort basically to deter the state from going on with demolition of outposts, removal of outposts. And we're seeing the violence now. Several of the attacks have been deadly. So in the past, price tag focused on cutting down trees, olive trees usually of Palestinians, destroying agricultural land, destroying cars, graffiti. We're now seeing an increasing resort to violence. So just in recent months, we had an attack on a female Palestinian driver who was killed. Before that, of course, we had 2 cases in which Palestinian families were burned alive by settlers who torched their home, or in the case of Mohammed Abu Khader, kidnapped, tortured, and lit on fire. So there is a shift, just not in the right direction. As for interactions with Palestinians, I understand where your question is coming from, right? Because Israeli settlers actually interact with Palestinians a lot more than the general Israeli public. because very few Palestinians are able to enter Israel proper and interact with Israelis. But those interactions are not in any way equal. It's in a way like saying, that people in the South, in the United States in the past, white folks there had more interactions with African Americans, but that did not lead to greater friendship, or because the relationship is just extremely unequal. And I can say, as someone who grew up there, that the violence inflicted on Palestinians, the restrictions on their daily life, were largely transparent to us. You live there, but you do not actually see. And I think that is because ideology is such a powerful force that it blinds you to reality.
I think I would add the geographical issue here. I think if you look at the geographical deployment of settlements in the West Bank, you'd see that around Gush Etzion and Efrat, you have more sophisticated settlers, usually the disciples of Rabbi Menachem Foreman. Now they are operating under the umbrella of a land for all, Eretz Lechulam. And I think this very small, ineffective as of yet, unfortunately, minority of settlers see the Palestinians as occupied people. If not occupied land, living on occupied land, because they're settlers and they believe that the land is should be just a Jewish land, but still they recognize the fact that these are occupied people. And since it comes from people from the religious Orthodox side of the political map and the social map in Israel, I think it's an important development. But as I said, unfortunately, as of yet, ineffective.
I would just add 2 data points. One, there was an interesting debate around Khan al-Ahmar, which is being a village, a Palestinian Bedouin village near Ma'ale Adumim, which is going to be completely demolished. And there was actually one of the key settler politicians came out opposing the demolition, basically saying, we're here legitimately, they were even here before us, we don't need to be demolishing their village. It showed quite an interesting fracturing within the opinion by generation or by whatever it was. The other thing I would actually point out is, or I would recommend, is a recent article in Haaretz by the head of Peace Now Settlement Watch, who is a settler, grew up in the settlement like our colleagues here, who now works with Peace Now, commenting on the rise of more extreme violence. And it is a very powerful and painful piece, but extremely important, I think. I would continue.
Interesting part of it. Your discussion about, if you will, all rights to the Palestinians as individuals and none to them as a nation. I wonder how sustainable that is. It seems to me it's sort of the Bedouinization of Palestinians or whatever. And with the Bedouins recently and the Druze and the Abu Ghosh, but none of those groups have in recent years been quite as successful because of the right wing's drawing of lines against how feasible would it be even if it were politically desired?
Not feasible at all. Not feasible at all. I mean, I agree basically. You can't treat the Palestinians as individuals or simply as individuals because they're part of a collective and part of a nation. And the Jewish nationalism or Zionism has to come to terms with the Palestinians as a nation and share the land. Yeah, that won't work otherwise.
All right, so
I'm Maureen Shea, and I wonder, Asaf, given your background, what was your personal evolution to where you are now in your beliefs?
and I'm going to do a perfecting amendment. I'd like you both to answer that because you both have just the most interesting backgrounds for folks doing this kind of work.
I think I had gone through 2 turning points. One was obviously the injury and understanding gradually that after I was injured, my country supported me, and in healthcare and assistance and whatever, because I'm a disabled military veteran. And on the other side, we do basically the same things to Palestinians, but they have no state to back them, and they have no state institutions, and they have no healthcare, and they have nothing, because we control the infrastructure and we control everything. So what does it mean how powerful it is to be in a state and be a citizen of a state, and so that was the first turning point. The second turning point was when I was the secretary of the Israeli Oriental Society, which is the umbrella of Islam and Middle East scholars in Israel, and I saw how the organization works from within. Basically, that we all deal with Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, never with ourselves, but we are part of the equation, and we are probably the most powerful part of the equation, and yet we don't criticize ourselves. We don't see ourselves in developments. When we talk about the occupation, we always talk about the Palestinians, never talk about the occupation. So that was the professional turning point for me.
So I mentioned briefly the process that I went through, and I would say that Israel is not a closed society. Information is available in Israel. It's not the Middle East, countries that ban books or whatever. But still, only one narrative is taught in Israeli schools, and I heard only one narrative in the community around me. I think being exposed to narratives of other people, even if not agreeing with some of them, really made me realize that no matter what I've been taught, that the Palestinians are not a real people. They're a kind of a new phenomenon. Why should they get their own state? It's part of this ideology of really erasing Palestinian nationalism. What matters is not how we perceive the Palestinians, but how they perceive themselves. We don't get to dictate to other people how they perceive themselves, their sense of identity. And also, through these conversations with people, I went back and started reading books and research that is available in Israel, but it's just not taught in schools, about the history of the conflict, about 48, about this region as a whole. Reading scholarship on the Middle East that is produced by Arabs and not just about Arabs. And that really, to me, opened my eyes. I then became engaged, started working for human rights organizations in Israel, focusing on the rights of refugees, migrants, human trafficking victims, later Palestinians in Gaza. And through that work, also became kind of acquainted with what does it mean to preserve a Jewish character of the state in the eyes of the Israeli government. So maintaining a Jewish character means maintaining a demographic majority and control of territory. And I think that is incompatible with Jewish values. I'm a third generation Holocaust survivor. Most of the people living in Israel who are Jewish are survivors of some kind of persecution. And therefore, I think that when we prioritize demography and maintaining power over others, over other values, that is just inconsistent, I think, with our history. So that's kind of how my shift happened.
Is there any indication of a growing, organized Palestinian and Arabs in general in Israel movement, nonviolent, like we've seen in South Africa, India, or here in the United States?
I think that in order to embrace nonviolent activism, you have to be a strong society. A weak society turns to violence, and a strong society embraces nonviolent means. The Palestinian society, disenfranchised and oppressed by the Israeli occupation, cannot be a strong society. It's a weak society. And if we, peace seekers in Israel, want the Palestinians to embrace nonviolence, then we have to support them and make them stronger, because there are trends in the Palestinian. I mean, and you've seen it throughout the last year, with at least in the beginning of the March of Return in Gaza. I think even Hamas recognizes the fact that it cannot beat Israel militarily, of course, because Israel is a superpower, a regional superpower. So I think that you do have this kind of thinking in Palestinian society, but this society has to be much stronger in order to collectively embrace the idea of nonviolence.
So I'm actually going to intervene here just for a second. I want to just clarify, this is important. The Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, PA, have absolutely maintained their commitment to nonviolence, and they have carried that out, and they continue security cooperation. That may be now in doubt because of the US law, which is going to change our funding, that cooperation continues. Palestinians as a whole, we in the United States and Israelis looking at media get a steady diet of every story of any kind of violence. The reality is that the Palestinian capacity in East Jerusalem, where you have both means, motive, and opportunity, Palestinian use of violence is very, very, very small. It is so small that it is the exception that proves the rule. In the West Bank, if you tomorrow drive somewhere in the West Bank, I was there just recently, each time I go, I see settlers walking around the road hitchhiking. I think that defies everybody's impression that but even today, the idea that every Palestinian or a large or even the majority or even a large percentage of Palestinians are systematically engaging in violence at every opportunity against Jews, against Israelis, is simply not true. The fact is, for a population that has lived under occupation for more than 50 years, the incidence of use of violence, by the way, any use of violence against civilians is unacceptable, but the incidence of use of violence here is exceptionally low, given all the motive, all the means, and all the opportunity that the occupation and particularly the settlements in the West Bank provide. That is the fact that is not, I think, understood well when we look at it. And when I go to an event and someone says, well, where's the Palestinian peace now? The answer is the Palestinian peace now is every Palestinian who is saying, I am going to oppose by other means. And that does exist, and that has been the trend for many, many years.
Yeah, and
I couldn't agree more with that. Thank you.
As for Palestinians inside Israel, the last elections, there was, the joint list that united all Palestinian parties. Right now, it seems that they're going to run 3 separate lists again, which means that at least one of them is not going to cross the electoral threshold. And I think that definitely undermines the political power. We have not really seen a turn to nonviolent activism, sustained nonviolent activism, but of course there are protests happening, against wars, against military operations of all kinds. There are occasional strikes, for example, following the nationality law that was passed that basically stated that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people alone, and downgraded the status of Arabic. It's no longer an official language. So we saw some non-violent resistance there, but it's not part of a sustained campaign.
My name is Phil Wilcox. Some years ago, indeed for many years during what we call the peace process, lots of Americans, and I think quite a few Israelis, saw the leadership of the IDF and the Israeli security services as the strongest element of pragmatism, who would create self-perpetuating class of peacemakers. Indeed, more recently, before everything collapsed, there's a brilliant film of the several leaders of the Shabbat,
The gatekeepers.
the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And we've been told that the so-called old families or good families in Israel wanted to send their kids to the good units of the IDF or the Air Force. Perhaps the same thing is true for the Shabak, and that part of the Israeli society would be part of the solution. That hasn't happened. What has happened to the character and status of the IDF and security services leadership? And will they revive that element in that part of the Israeli leadership and do the right thing?
I think that we still, and Israeli military sociologists see this trend too, as that the leadership of the military security establishment in Israel are still, or is still pragmatic, but we're running out of time with these people because the low to mid-level officers and officials in the Israeli security establishment grew up under very different circumstances. They didn't witness and had no share in the peace, in the Oslo process and the peace between Jordan and Israel. But like in every society that's going through the phases that the Israeli society is going, I think there's still a force. The pragmatism is still a good force that we peace seekers can use to our benefit.
How many of their senior officials live in settlements?
I don't know. I don't think it's a big portion, as far as I know. I don't think it's a big portion. Even they, or at least some of them, are pragmatic. Pragmatic again. All of them are Zionists, of course, yeah, because state institutions are Zionists. They're entrenched with Zionism, like any other state institution in countries around the world. But pragmatic in the sense that they do not abide to the recklessness, irresponsibility of the political right wing in Israel. And obviously they've been pushing back against the right wing government throughout the past few years against very harsh measures that they wanted to take against the Palestinians. I'm talking about the political elite, of course. So I think there's still a force that we can use right now. In 10 years, they'll be gone.
All right, so we're going to take, I think there was, yes, one more question up here. And then we're going to let, maybe if there's time, a couple last words after you answer this question. And then someone is literally coming to take away the stage at 4 o'clock. So this is a hard end. Normally we can kind of putz around, so go ahead.
What do you think the impact of Netflix deciding to run Fauda is on how Americans perceive the conflict? And if there was another show, Israeli show, that you thought would, or maybe you think it's good, and if not, what single show would you bring to American audiences that you think would nuance our understanding of the conflict?
Okay, so I think the best show ever produced on Israeli politics is called Polishuk. It stopped airing a few years ago. Basically,
That would be for American politics.
it's now with the current administration, it's a perfect fit. Basically, it shows an Israeli politician kind of very mediocre, bumbling his way up, the ministerial positions, kind of by accident. You see so much of the informality of Israeli politics. In Israeli politics, you have high-ranking officials who have very funny nicknames. So we have, Netanyahu is Bibi, the former Minister of Defense is Bogi. Everyone has, like these funny nicknames that usually they get in the military. On that show, you have, Mumi and Pizzi and Futsi and all of that. And you really, and there's a particularly excellent episode about the interaction with the U.S. ambassador to Israel, kind of showing who's really in charge, what happens when, an Israeli minister tries to step out of line. And, as someone who has been familiar with the work of the U.S. Embassy in Israel in previous years, not under the current administration, definitely served as a check on some of the worst excesses of the Israeli government. And I think it is unfortunate that this is no longer the case. In fact, the politics of the current embassy, ambassador personally, are more to the right than many Israeli right-wing politicians. And even the politics of this administration, right? The decision to cut UNRWA aid was not supported by the Israeli government, was not supported by Netanyahu, and definitely opposed fiercely by the military establishment that is worried about a humanitarian crisis, particularly in Gaza. Several such decisions by the Trump administration were opposed quite strongly by the military establishment. So Polishuk, absolutely fantastic show. I don't think it's currently available with subtitles, but I really, really hope some Netflix exec is watching this feed and will bring it to the US.
I'll just say on Fauda, and for folks who've seen it, this is a remarkable show. It's Israeli produced. The problem with Fauda is that it's, and from my perspective, when I've talked to friends of mine, Palestinian friends who I think feel similarly, is it really does produce an Israeli lens onto the conflict. And it tries to show it in a balanced way, but it's a balanced way as mitigated or moderated through an Israeli perspective. I don't know any Palestinians who are comfortable with the way Palestinians are portrayed or believe it's a three-dimensional portrayal. And the fact that it's such an effective drama makes that almost worse. So maybe it's a question of balancing with more than one or something else. All right, we have 9 minutes. So I'm going to turn to you guys because we're actually going to have to clear the stage so they can clear out. So I would like to give you each an opportunity to say a couple of last words. You can make a pitch for the website. You can make a pitch for your own work or whatever you like to do. So we're going to start with Asaf and then go to Elizabeth to end it. And if you talk more than 4 minutes, I'll throw you off the stage.
No. 3.5. I'll just say two things. One is that, we usually try to, as organizations of social political change, you usually try to prevent catastrophe, but at the same time you try to prepare yourself for catastrophe. Our work, the forum's work vis-a-vis the establishment in Israel is in order to prevent catastrophe. Our work with the citizenry of Israel and the different communities in Israel is to prepare for catastrophe in the meaning of, as long as we see Palestinians, Arab Muslims as human beings, then the future will be less violent. We believe will be less violent because if you see the other as a human being and not as a threat, then whatever happens, one state, two state, second state solution, the atmosphere, the civic atmosphere in Israel will be better if we and other organizations like us are successful. And the second thing is always have hope. I think that both the personal stories of Elizabeth and mine are a sign of hope and that change is possible. We believe the change is possible. We talk to the Israeli public. We don't neglect the Israeli public. We acknowledge, we recognize the fears of the Israeli public, of Palestinians, Arab and Muslims. We try to tackle them. We try to portray a very complex picture of what we do to the Palestinians and how it motivates the Palestinians to push back at us or use violence against us. But always have hope. If we do not have hope, then it's meaningless.
Thank you. So I would like to use this opportunity at this stage to call for greater attention to ideological changes that are happening in the Middle East. Those are not easy to identify and research, but they are worth our attention. At the end of the day, the major social changes that have occurred through history occurred because of individuals one by one changing their minds. The mere fact that we are sitting here on the panel and there are 2 women here, unfortunately, is not the norm in DC, but the mere fact that we are allowed to be on stage is the result of social change. The mere fact that I'm wearing pants is the result of social change. And such changes are happening in the Middle East too. The region is not stagnant. The region, the population there has more access to information than ever before, is more connected than ever before, is extremely young because of high birth rates. That population is currently in a situation of an ideological void in a sense. The ideologies of the past, pan-Arabism, of Islamism, of radical jihadism, of the resistance brand offered by Hezbollah in Iran, have very much lost support among Arab youth and even the older generation. And there is now this vacuum that many forces are trying to fill. What regimes are telling their populations that you will live a non-political life. You will not engage in politics, and we will provide you with stability and very, very basic subsistence. And there are forces within the Middle East, activists that are still present on the ground, some are in exile, that are pushing back and are trying to fill that vacuum with liberal ideologies, leftist ideologies, with creative ideologies that tackle the challenges that their societies face. And those types of developments merit attention. And I think that there isn't enough attention paid to them in DC or in any other region that, in any other capital that tries to identify what will come next in the Middle East. Sure, hard power matters a great deal. At the end of the day, ideas oftentimes cannot overcome bullets or barrel bombs or torture chambers, but they have immense power, and our panel is just proof of that. Thank you.
Wow. Well, normally I ask people for final comments. I don't have super high expectations to be uplifting, and you both left us with thoughts that are provocative and uplifting, and for that I thank you, and I thank you for this enormously informative and I think important panel and for your work. I also want to thank the New Israel Fund, our partner in this event, and the Middle East Institute for hosting, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.